1 Corinthians 13, continuing on from his spiritual gifts discussion and describing, has he set the groundwork now that there's one body, many parts of that body, and each part performs a different function, but they all have the same purpose as they function together as the body. But he's saying that before we get back into the discussion of spiritual gifts and how to use each gift for its proper purpose, each gift has a different function, but the same purpose. Before we get back into that, though, we got to straighten out our attitude. There's an attitude problem at the heart of all this. So that's what we got to talk about now. 1 Corinthians 13. Well, last verse of chapter 12. Now I will show you the most excellent way. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but now he's using himself as a hypothetical example here. So he's saying, if I do this, if I do that, but he's using that as a saying, I could be doing these things, but they would be of no purpose or value because my attitude would be wrong. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but have not love, I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. Bang, 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 bang. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, which Jesus himself talked about, but have not love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and surrender my body to the flames, but have not love, I gain nothing. So there is no use in it. I could give everything away to somebody, have nothing left. I could even let them throw me into the fire. And if I didn't have love, I would have done that for nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It is not rude. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It doesn't say it's not angered. It's just not easily angered. There is such a thing as righteous anger. So it's not like it can't be angered. It's not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Doesn't hold grudges. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. Now these are gifts. He just got done listing those gifts in chapter 12, a couple of different places in chapter 12. Prophecies are a gift. Speaking in tongues is a gift. Knowledge is a gift. But all these things will eventually have fulfilled their purpose. All these things, all these spiritual gifts, both the ones you have and the ones you don't have, the ones you want, the ones you have, the ones you want, the ones you don't want, the ones, whatever. They have a purpose. And someday, that purpose will be fulfilled, and therefore you won't need the spiritual gifts anymore. But after that, even after that day comes, there will still be love. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, so we don't have full knowledge yet. But when perfection comes, the imperfection disappears. You won't need that anymore. When I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, and I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. Now we see but a poor reflection as in a mirror. Remember, their mirrors in that day and time would not have been as clear and smooth as ours. They could have seen each themselves in mirrors, but they wouldn't have given as clear a reflection as our mirrors today would. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. Now I think he's obviously talking ultimately about seeing Christ. I mean, yes, that's the fullest fulfillment of this will come when we see Christ face to face. But I think I think this principle applies even beyond that. As you mature, these teaching tools that you needed in order to help get you to maturity will become unnecessary. When you're learning how to ride a bike, you may have training wheels. But when you've learned how to ride a bike, you don't need training wheels anymore. When you're learning how to do something, you may need all these props and aids to assist you in doing something, but when you become proficient at it, you don't need it anymore. He's been talking about maturities all throughout this book. He's been calling them infants. He's been saying, I want you to have solid milk I want you to have solid food and not have to rely on milk all the time. So there is, yes, this whole section will obviously find its final fulfillment when we all see Christ, when we're in the kingdom, and it finally has come on earth as it is in heaven. But I think it's beyond. I think there's more to it than that. I think it also applies even because prophecies don't. There are no more apostles. We already mentioned that earlier. The apostles were a one generation kind of thing, and when they were gone, they were gone. There were no other apostles to replace them after the apostles were gone. I think prophecy is ultimately the same. Prophecy is a revelation that comes from God. And we'll read about that in chapter 14. And he said here about prophecy, if I have to get to prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge. That's kind of what he means by when he says prophecy, and how they're using it here in the first century, because there hadn't been a prophet since Malachi in Israel's history, and that was 500 years earlier practically. So the Old Testament prophets have been gone for a long time. John the Baptist came along and he spoke. And now the New Testament church has prophets, but these prophets are there to speak the word of God to the people before it was written out and compiled and made available. I believe that once the apostles, Paul and Peter and John, finished writing down their corpus of material, which we now call the New Testament, and that became available to the church on a wide scale, I believe prophecy ultimately ceased. Now, and that would have been I don't think that would have happened right after Paul. Paul, there was only ever one generation of apostles. Once that generation came and went, the apostles were gone. There have not been any apostles since then. Because of the length of time it took in which for these letters to be compiled and written and copied, I think prophecy probably would have continued for another couple of generations after this. It would have eventually ceased, though. Now, it's possible that God may still speak through prophets, through the mouths of people, in prophecy in certain circumstances. If the word is being preached in an area of the world where the message has not been written down yet and available to the people, it's possible that maybe God still empowers people to speak his message directly via prophecy as in olden days. He may even still do this in limited circumstances in churches today, maybe. I don't know, okay? I'm not going to say he can't do that. If God chooses to communicate that way occasionally today, through the mouth of a speaker in the way that he used to, I'm not going to say he can't. But I will say that even that it's ultimately intended to grow someone to maturity. Okay, it's not intended to be a forever thing. I mean, the Old Testament prophets eventually stopped coming. He eventually when he had given Old Testament Israel his full revelation that he had for them at that time, he stopped speaking. He stopped sending prophets to them to speak for him. So there does come a point when there is no more prophetic message to reveal, because everything that we need to have has been revealed. And these are ultimately teaching tools that are designed to get us to maturity. And once they've done that, their purpose has been fulfilled and they're no longer needed. I think this is true also for some of the things that we hang on to. Okay? And this is where we get into trouble with a lot of our man-made traditions. He's going to talk about traditions. He already has talked about traditions. There are some traditions that are good traditions. Paul himself has mentioned a couple already in this letter, and he'll mention more to come. Okay, but we make up our own traditions, which Jesus yelled at the Pharisees for doing, and that can get in the way. Maybe not all of our traditions are bad per se, but I think sometimes our traditions at their best can be seen as a kind of teaching tool that maybe at some point eventually outgrow. in my old church, which I still go to occasionally, so it's not really fair to call it my own, but maybe my home church, maybe, Zion, which is a Lutheran church, the Lutherans in general follow the church year, and a lot of traditional denominations follow the church year. I'm not crazy about the church year concept because the New Testament never mentions it. Never at any point in the New Testament are we called to follow anything like a church year. In fact, if anything, in Colossians, Paul kind of criticizes that and says we probably, if anything, I get the impression we shouldn't do that. The church year, as it exists now and has existed for centuries as a man-made custom, is modeled off our Old Testament Israel. In fact, a lot of traditional worship service, which comes from Catholicism, which Lutherans have adapted and borrowed for their own purposes, and other denominations as well. A lot of that comes from Catholicism, and that itself ultimately is rooted in Old Testament Israel temple worship. The priestly garments, the altar, the sacred days, the calendar. Okay, that's all Old Testament stuff. And the New Testament never tells us to do any of that. In fact, if anything, the New Testament indicates that we shouldn't do that. I'm not entirely opposed to the church year because it has some benefit, I think. As we'll read when we get to chapter 14, and the point of chapter 14 is ultimately to have harmony and peace and order in your assemblies. The church year can help structure that, okay, because they get the church year, part of the church year concept is that they have certain scripture readings that are to be read on certain Sundays of the church year. The lexicon, the lexical readings that they go through every couple of years. They read through essentially the entire Bible, or at least the entire selection of readings. And that's good, okay, and that then in turn gives them the subject matter for their sermons, okay. So having that kind of structure can be good. Having a structured, orderly worship system which perpetuates itself year after year, decade after decade, century after century, that can be good. That's not bad. But even at its best, I think we should look at it as basically being a teaching tool. Okay, we don't really need to do that. We don't need to follow the church year. At its best, it can be something that can help us grow into maturity, but maybe at some point we should say we don't need this anymore. My current church, the Greater Alton Church, has what we call the theme of, they don't have a church year, but they have a theme of the year. Every year they come up with although they haven't done this as much lately, but every year they come up with like a theme, which is going to be like their anthem for the year. And that's not bad. That's a man-made tradition. Okay, it's made up. We don't need to do that. The New Testament never tells us to do that. That's something that they decided, way back when this congregation started, 40 years ago, whenever they decided they were going to do that. I wasn't there then, of course. I came along years later. It's not bad, but again, that's one of those things where I don't know if we really need it anymore. And I have actually said that. I have expressed that thought to the leadership in the past. Do we really need the church year concept any longer? That to me is something that I would consider to be like a training tool, like a teaching tool that helps us grow into maturity. But there comes a point when we probably should not keep using it because we should be mature enough not to need it. And I think that there comes a point, like the church year concept, because that's been around for centuries. Like that's not going anywhere. It'll take the second coming of Christ to get rid of the church year concepts. But so there comes a point where I think these things can be actually hindrances. Like we are actually holding ourselves back by holding on to these teaching tools because we have grown past the point of needing them, and still relying on them means we're not being as productive as we should be. It's kind of like learning how to type, and there just comes a point when you need to just when you're learning how to type, your instinct is to look at the keyboard. I learned how to type on a typewriter, actually. I'm old enough now. I'm old enough that when I learned how to type, we were still learning on typewriters. Now, I think they still have typing classes in high school and stuff. Kids today are exposed to keyboards from their birth, practically, with all the devices we have. So I think they just kind of naturally learn how to type in a way that I didn't. Like, growing up as a child, like I was not naturally exposed to keyboards. And so I had to be taught formally how to type. I took a typing program. Like I actually taught myself somewhat how to type in 8th grade in a typing program. after school, and then I took an actual keyboarding class when I was a freshman in high school. Like I said, I was taught, the keyboarding class, we were still using typewriters at the time. So I learned how to type on a typewriter. But, when you start typing, your instinct is to look at your fingers, to look at the keyboard. The typing teacher will tell you not to do that, and will tell you to look at the screen, okay? Or in the typewriter's case, look at the paper. But that's you have to learn how to train yourself to do that. But your instinct is to look at the keyboard, okay? There comes a point when you should not be looking at the keyboard any longer, okay? You should be looking at the screen, or the paper. When I learned how to type, I was actually typing on a typewriter with the paper coming out of it. But you should be looking at the screen. You should not be looking at the keyboard. And there comes a point where looking at the keyboard is actually going to hold you back. It's actually going to slow you down. You should be advanced, and you should eventually get to the point where you don't need to do that. I think I don't know, spiritual gifts, and I think in addition to spiritual gifts, I think there are a lot of different things that we do that can fall into this category of teaching tools that can be useful up to a certain point, like spiritual gifts are, like prophecy even is. He's even saying prophecy has a shelf life. As valuable as that is, and he even says you desire to get to, he tells him to do that in chapter 14. But even that has a shelf life. Even that has a purpose that will eventually be fulfilled. And when it is, it's no longer needed. And I think we come up with a lot of other things that can be in that category too. Teaching tools that can help us grow into maturity, but there does come a point where we no longer need them, and we may be better off letting them go because they're holding us back after a while, after a certain point. So anyway, I think his statement here, his paragraph here about, incompletion versus completion, yes, it has its final fulfillment in the day of Christ when we all do see Jesus face to face. Although even then, I don't think we'll know everything. Even when we enter the kingdom and the kingdom comes on earth as it is in heaven, I don't think each of us is going to suddenly be filled with every bit of knowledge that God has in his repertoire. I don't think that's going to happen. But even when we do know Christ as well as he knows us now, I think that is ultimately going to be the final fulfillment of what he's saying here, but I think this principle can apply even before that. And I think it could apply even to things that don't really fall into the category of spiritual gifts. Like, I don't think the church year is a spiritual gift. I don't think the theme of the year is a spiritual gift. But I think these things could fall into that same category, ultimately as teaching tools that are designed to have a function to build up the church and grow the church. And eventually, the church no longer needs it. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. Faith will eventually be replaced with sight, and hope will be satisfied. The hope we have for the future will eventually be fulfilled. Will eventually be satisfied. But love will endure, even into the next world. That's actually the language of the next world. We got to practice that language here and now, because that's the language we'll be speaking in the age to come. But faith will eventually be replaced with sight, and hope will eventually be fulfilled. But love will endure.